What about you? What's your story?
My story, I am what is commonly known as a serial killer. I don't love that nomenclature. I sort of consider myself a murderer, but my numbers are such that I am now classified as a serial killer.
Serial killer.
Okay. Yes, I am a killer. I have killed 39 people. This is something that I love to do. It's the greatest job in the world. It's what I'm built to do. But I'm also turning 40 this year, which is like, grays in the beards, a lot of stuff happening, and it's making me a little midlifey, and it's kind of sent me into a little bit of a spiral. I don't trust my instincts anymore, and I feel like I may have lost what made me great.
That the only thing we have to fear is itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks? Why do I say this? Because we got Holy Ghost power!
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre.
Hello and welcome to the 103rd episode of the Fear of God podcast. 103. Here we are, just trucking along. You know, the Fear of God podcast, if you've never been with us before, we occupy that rather abandoned intersection between faith and horror. Talking to you right now is Nathan Rouse. One of your intrepid co-hosts. Typically with me is fellow co-host Reed Lackey. He was here a second ago, and it was a little weird, I'm going to be honest with you. He did say he wanted to go get a towel so we could slap each other like in a locker room. And I was like, I never did that in the locker room, you know. But y'all, while he's gone, I thought I'm going to show him because y'all can't see it now, but I'm butt naked because apparently that breaks it breaks the wall down, you know? They just say if you're just naked with someone else, it just breaks down that wall, you know? So, I mean, it's going to be a weird one, y'all. But just buckle up, cause here we go. Just steamrolling into number 2. While we wait on Reed, and y'all get into whatever state of clothedness or not that you'd like to, because it does break down walls. If you haven't yet before, we would love it if maybe not after the last minute, but we would love it if you would go to iTunes and leave us a rating, leave us a review, subscribe to this podcast, just to get so much more frivolity and ridiculousness that you've come to know and love and or despise, but yet you keep coming back because we're just that show. So please go do that. Reed, hey, watch it, buddy. Nope, please don't. Put the towel down. Put the towel down, okay?
You want me to put the towel down?
I do want you to put well, yes. Because the image I was going for is you smacking me, and now you make it sound like you're wearing one and I'm telling you to put it down. That's not... there's a whole lot of mixed signals going on here, buddy. And
I thought we were doing this thing. We're not doing this thing? Okay, all right. I misunderstood. You know, here's what's funny about that.
What's funny about that? Tell me.
Normally, I would push back a lot and be like, oh my gosh, we're going to do that. I'm gonna.
But it's episode 103.
No. That has nothing to do with it. If you've seen this film, then like listeners who would approach this, and it's like, if you've remotely seen this film, you know everything that we're referring to, and it makes perfect sense. So we're just gonna roll with it.
Yeah. I mean, you're introduced to Mark's Duplass for the first time. At least my first time. I don't know. Maybe he's shown up in other movies along with Mark.
So
and
can we?
Jay.
So before we get into all of our other stuff, can we comment on the fact that like that particular moment, that specific moment, like we said about Creep, the original Creep, it's like I kept sitting there like, is this really about to happen? Like, is he really gonna do that? Oh, he did.
Let's come back to this. I mean, I'm with you, but I want to spend more. I really want us to camp out on that moment.
Okay. It deserves some of our time.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Fear of God. We are in a small series here called Number 2. Man, it is just everywhere. It's just all you can't say 2 sentences without walking into a dick or poop joke.
Oh my gosh. Listeners, what I'm hoping won't happen is listeners who are like, man, they kept it so classy for 100 episodes and now they've just decided to just rip the towel away. Let's just do whatever. That's funny.
Yeah. So yes, we're in a little series here, 3-episode series called Number 2, where we are examining some classic, some campy, some sequels. That's what this series is all about, in addition to just having some Fear of God inside jokery going on. Before we get, dadgummit, I was trying to figure out if I could sing What You Watching to the tune of my ding-a-ling, but I can't get it.
Get it? I'm so tempted to just leave that sentence in.
Please, I don't care. You know me. I don't care. I just let it all hang out. Here I am. It's all me. Vulnerability before the Lord, brother. Dance like David danced, like just go for it. So anyway, what are you watching? What are you reading? What are you listening to? Ow!
Oh my gosh.
Oh my goodness. Reed, what are you watching? What are you reading? What are you listening to, brother?
Okay,
just give me just one, okay? Because I really want to get to Mark's Duplass and Duplass, okay? I really.
So it's getting mixed to negative reviews, which disappoints me because I really enjoyed it. But as listeners probably know by now, I have been a long-standing fan since the second season, a long-standing loyal fan even through some of the weaker years of The Simpsons. Well, as every creative in the world is at least doing something for Netflix, Matt Groening, creator of the series The Simpsons, dropped a new 10-episode series onto Netflix only called Disenchantment. And I watched all of it, and I really dug it. Like, I really liked it. It's not the kind of thing, I will say this as sort of a blanket statement, that if you are a fan of The Simpsons at some of their weaker moments, I'm not saying like some of their, like, wow, that's not funny at all, because they've definitely had moments like that. But if you're a fan of some of their more mediocre moments, then I think you'll be really genuinely impressed by Disenchantment because it feels rather fresh. The reason I set it up that way is because if you're a fan of like prime rib Simpsons, like that season 3 through 9 Simpsons, Disenchantment definitely doesn't reach those heights, but it's genuinely clever. It's genuinely fun. It tells a story that at first feels very episodic, like the first maybe 6 or 7 episodes feel very self-contained and just like, oh, these are wacky little adventures in this little world. But then towards the end, set up a larger, I won't say richer yet, but larger, more complex mythology that may play itself out in future seasons. They've already been renewed for a season 2. So I don't know exactly where they're going with it, but I genuinely enjoyed it. And I will say, like, if you're a fan of pretty clever, when I say adult animation, there's nothing dirty or perverted in it. It's just the jokes are a little bit more geared towards mature sensibilities. Then I would definitely say to give Disenchantment a chance, because I really enjoyed it. I was surprised after finishing it to see that the reviews were somewhat mediocre to negative. But again, I'm only giving, maybe that's appropriate because I'm only giving kind of a half-hearted recommendation as it is, but I've really enjoyed it and I thought it was good.
And you did finish it? Is that what you said?
Oh yeah, I watched all of it.
Yeah. I've seen pretty tepid response to it, but which is unfortunate because someone like me who has a distance affection for The Simpsons, like I appreciate it. I don't have the brain for it or the time, the bandwidth for it, but might appreciate a Groening enterprise to have
Yes.
a tepidly reviewed Disenchantment, I'm like, that's all right. I'll pass.
No, I understand. Can I share before you give
Yeah.
yours one joke from it that I thought was really funny? There's a
Please.
demon. There's a demon character in it, and as like a main character, and he's very witty. But there's one point at which he's like possessed this girl, and this exorcist is trying to drive him out. And when the exorcist is trying to drive him out, he's like, "This will require the sacred tool." And then the demon looks at him and goes, "You're a sacred tool." And I just thought that joke was really funny.
It's just going to be that. It's just going to be that episode, isn't it?
I'm not even drinking anything tonight. I'm drinking Mountain Dew. I really got Mountain Dew over here, but it's so funny. I just thought that joke was so funny. He's like, "This will require the sacred tool," and the demon goes, "You're a sacred tool." And I just thought it was funny. It struck me by surprise, and I loved it. What are you watching, Nathan? What are you watching, reading, or listening?
Wow. Well, you know what? I'm going to surprise you here. I'm going to go high-minded.
Uh-oh.
So, actually, I referenced months ago the podcast, I think called Bookish, with Sonia Walger of Lost. Look, I love Lost, and how she featured Damon Lindelof on an episode, and in that interview, he referenced the book Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. Have you read this?
I haven't read that one, but but I'm familiar with Colson Whitehead.
Okay, well, it's funny. I just downloaded it because of Lindelof's recommendation, because goodness gracious, he really gave it a very, very, very strong endorsement. And honestly, just looking it up, I'm about halfway through it. Looking it up for Talking About Now, I was like, oh, it won the Pulitzer Prize. Oh, it's a National Book Award winner. So I really didn't know those things before reading it. It was purely just his recommendation. So far, it's very captivating. It's my wife just gets on to me. She's like, "Why do you do this to yourself?" I mean, it's it is fiction, but it's like not, I mean, it's heavy.
Okay. Yeah.
Heavy, hard, sad slavery fiction. And I remember reading We Were 8 Years in Power and just like shaking my head back and forth in bed at night. And she's like, you just love torturing yourself, don't you? So then I turn on Creep 2 and all's right with the world. But no, I am reading Underground Railroad. I highly recommend it. I will check in with us again when I finish it, presuming that recommendation stands. But it's powerful. It's tragic and sad and really great fiction. So that is what I am reading.
Nice. So, ladies and gentlemen, that has been yet another installment of What Are You Watching? What are you reading? What are you listening to?
I love, like, we are willfully trying to change the tune. Like, it's hard for me. It is hard for me to like change the tune because it's so ingrained.
No, it's true.
Whether it's just enunciating all of the words instead of just these sort of more abbreviated kind of casual version. Or the more formalized operatic version,
Oh my gosh. Well, before we get into Mark's Duplass, so basically, we did hear from quite a few of you, and we now have a full list of 100 films, okay? 100 films that are your official nominees for hashtag I love the 80s. So hashtag I love the 80s is coming in October. If you will check the various social media outlets, you will see our good old faithful Survey Monkey survey up there. Like we did with the 90s, you're going to be voting on your favorites by year. Some years there are enough entries to you're going to pick 3 favorites. Some you're going to pick 5 favorites. Some you're going to pick only 1 or 2. But all of the years are broken down. So the films are separated into the year they were released, and you're going to pick your favorites there. We have some math behind the scenes that then produces a top 100 list, and hashtag I love the 80s will feature films from your selected top 10. So make your way over to the social media feed. If for some reason you do not have a Facebook, a Twitter, an Instagram, but you want to participate in the survey, email us fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com, and we will send you the survey directly. So I just had to make a plug for hashtag I love the 80s.
I'm glad you did.
I'm excited.
I like the 80s, brother.
Oh, it's going to be so fun. I mean, I'm so excited.
Yeah, that was a good decade. The Nintendo came out in the 80s.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yes, it did. And the world was forever changed.
What else happened in the 80s? The Berlin Wall came down.
I just love that you're like, the Nintendo was released. What
you can tell what defined my youth.
Like, what else happened?
Anything else?
I think
there was
Zelda
there was 1,
something.
then there was Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link. Mario 3, The Wizard came out, and it featured Mario Brothers 3 and showed you how to get the first warp whistle. That's really the summation of the 80s.
You know, you mentioned, you know, the Berlin Wall fell down, but we can't lose sight of the biggest political game changer in the history of the United States of America, in which Rocky Balboa single-handedly defeated Ivan Drago in the 80s. I mean, like, come on, like,
and
priorities.
Apparently, you know, what's old is new again, and Ivan Drago's progeny is going to make an appearance in Creed 2, and oh my God.
Oh, I'm so excited about that movie. Man, I'm so excited. I'm so eager. But we can't go there.
Time is a flat circle.
Oh.
So yeah, the 80s. I love the 80s. You love the 80s. We all love the 80s and ice cream. So Reed, today we are back at it. We are joining our old friend, whatever his name is.
This time around, it's Aaron.
Right. For Creep 2. So, peek behind the curtain here. When we were sort of hatching this little series, we were very intentional, you know, because, I mean, whether it's horror or any other genre, there's just so many stupid sequels. And it was really valuable to us. There was a few criteria, and I think you'd speak to this too, Reed. One, you know, Freddy versus Jason took whatever criteria we might have had and just threw it out the window. And
I was like,
that
wins. Yes.
Chopped it with an axe, sliced it with some finger knives. But it's so like Gonzo. It's kind of its own thing. It just sort of serves as a sequel. But, you know, we didn't want you guys to have to do a ton of work. You know, if you hadn't seen something we've not covered, we didn't want to cover something we hadn't already covered an initial entry to. We may get there at some point, but right now it was like, well, let's do the lowest barrier to entry that's also going to potentially yield some pretty different conversation or more robust version of conversations of the first go round. So I had put on the table an interest in Creep 2 just because I really was a fan of the first one. And Reed had already seen it, naturally, but was able to say, yeah, I do think there's some different things. Because the last thing we want to do to each other or you guys is just rehash the same old conversation.
Right,
like, okay, well, you know, the same talking points from one entry to its subsequent follow-up. So Creep 2, you know, kind of made the short list and just kind of kept staying on that short list until ultimately it's like, okay, these are the 3 we want to do. So last week was Freddy versus Jason. This week we are doing Creep 2. And next week we will be looking at Purge Anarchy. It is worth mentioning one little bit of business, Read, while before we're fully into this. You mentioned this a couple weeks ago. As a reminder, on the horizon is Quarterly King 4, which will in fact be featuring The Stand.
Absolutely.
You know, if you've never seen it, if you've never read it, you definitely have time to watch it. You might not have time to read it if you're starting from scratch. But, you know, wanting to remind you guys that is coming. Refresh yourself if you've read it before or seen it before. Expose yourself anew to it. Expose yourself to it if you've never done so before. It is a worthy tome. And it is, in fact, a tome. But we will be discussing that very shortly in Quarterly King 4. But enough of that. Here we are. Creep 2.
Dun, dun,
so, I don't remember who it was, but someone on the Facebook group recently was like, right after we started the Facebook group, shortly after it, was like, oh my gosh, did y'all get a load of Mark in Creep 2? And I was like, oh man, spoilers. I don't want to know. So I didn't read that thread. And then I just knew, for what it's worth, and, you know, we've alluded to this up till now, Mark Duplass does appear full frontal in it. What I was worried might happen in this movie was far worse than what actually happens. I was like, oh, yeah, that's,
I understand. Okay. Yeah.
That's a naked adult man, you know? But anyway, so that happens in the movie. So is this your second time seeing this, Reed?
This is my second time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw it actually prior to, I had seen it before we recorded on the first one, on the very first Creep.
It is not fair to say your level of Freddy versus Jason, your level of passion for Freddy versus Jason is similar here, but dude, I really liked this movie a lot.
Sure, sure. I understand. Yeah.
I liked Creep 1 a lot. And I can even recognize the weaknesses of Creep 1, or Creep, as it's titled. And they almost just eliminate all of the weaknesses of Creep with Creep 2. Like, it does not feel meandering in the sort of way that Creep can feel a little bit. You know, it's very tight and very direct and definitely does some different things with its narrative. I really, really dug this movie a lot.
Nice. You know what's funny that you mentioned that? So we are not about to have a Stranger Things 2 moment. It's nowhere near that, because I agree with everything that you said. But I did notice, and I noticed it the first time through, and when I watched it the second time, I was attentive to this, because, and this is just my experience of it or my take on it. The film, for the first maybe 45 minutes to the 50-minute mark, for me, has me like riveted. Like I don't even want to look away from the screen. Culminating in, and I'm sure we'll get into some specifics here in a little bit, culminating in that scene sort of in their basement area where he's in the tub, she gets into the tub and all that stuff. And here's what's weird, because it happened the very first time I watched the movie, and I was ready and like wanting to dive in, but it happened again the second time I watched the movie. From the moment the sort of tub scene ends through till their
tubby time?
Their tubby time, yes. From the moment their tubby time ends until they make it to the woods, I find myself zoning in and out. I find myself lapsing.
We're definitely not going to have a Stranger Things 2. Like, I'm by no means am I saying like this is a perfect film. I would, shout from the rooftops. I would disrobe and expose all I've got in order to petition and campaign for this movie. I just think I was so impressed with the form.
Sure.
And honestly, for our purposes, this movie is not scary. Like it just is to me. There's one or two kind of little like the sort of what you think is her murder at the end is a bit alarming, but
sure.
For what Creep 1 accomplishes in terms of the dread, they completely intentionally deflate that balloon in this.
Yes.
One.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think because I totally agree with you. I think there's an easy case to be made that it does sort of lag a little bit here and there. I just think I was so taken with the inversion of the concept.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't seen either of these, the first Creep, a videographer that is not Duplass responds to a Craigslist ad. We go back and listen to that first episode, but he is a definitive mark for what you learn is Duplass's character's serial killer. Well, this one, similar sort of setup, but what you learn is she is as much. It just kind of inverts it. They become equals, and it's a really fascinating back and forth that happens when you've got, and part of it is her performance. I mean, she just really
she's incredible.
Holds her own, no question, with him in this movie, and in the way that I think the first one, you kind of just have to buy in that Aaron guy goes along with it all. I don't know if I totally think this is realistic, but whatever, I'm along for the ride. Hers feels more organic and natural. It's like, okay, she's not really safe, but she gives some compelling reasons that you could make the case might be thin, but do make sense for her as a character to stick around.
Yeah. Well, see, this is what I love about this film. And I can't remember if I mentioned this in the first Fear of God Creep episode, but what impressed me significantly in the viewing of this both times was every single time where you think the film would likely like hide its hand or like pretend or give a conceit about something, it just goes ahead and puts its cards on the table every single time. What I mean by that is you think, oh, she's walking in. She has no idea he's a serial killer. What's going to happen because she has no idea he's a serial killer? But we know. And then he tells her straight up.
Oh, it's great.
In the first 10 minutes that they're together, he's like, so I'm a serial killer. I'm a murderer. And you're sitting here like, oh my gosh, what?
Well, to me, what's so fascinating about that, and, you know, we can if you want, but don't have to have like a minor conversation here about just sort of screenwriting, or storytelling. Storytelling, especially in film, is just all about what the characters are keeping from each other. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, in the first film, you suspect there's something weird about this guy.
Right.
And you come to learn your suspicions are correct, but he is clearly keeping information. So it's so anomalous of an experience as a viewer, because though it is a sequel, we know who this character is. And so he sits there and says to her at the 10-minute mark, by the way, I'm a serial killer. I've done all these things. You know, don't worry. I'm not going to kill you for the next 24 hours or whatever. And what's impressive about the narrative is she doesn't buy it.
Yeah, that's what's great.
To me, that's just such a deft storytelling maneuver, and why I would say it's a very worthy kind of sequel. It does not just kind of rehash and go back to the same ideas.
And so this is what, like, getting back to that like, I'll mention two things. So her character, again, you think there's going to be all these sort of hidden conceits in it, but you mentioned earlier how it gives you direct reasons why she would stay. Like when she has that moment where she goes into the bathroom and she's like, okay,
yeah,
all of your red flags are going up. And then and that's why. And I mean, there are people who feel this way, and I'm not even about to get into this debate, but there are people who feel like, okay, there should never be any reason for nudity in film. And they make some strong cases for that, or I have heard some compelling arguments on both sides of it. I am personally in the camp that when the narrative justifies it, and when the narrative and it's not gratuitous, that it is actually forwarding these characters' relationships or some element, degree of the plot, then I feel like there's some merit to it. Yes, we can get into the creative discussions about that. That's not for this moment. When he comes, this moment we keep alluding to, if you haven't seen this film, is he recognizes that she doesn't believe him, so he shows her the ending of the first film and shows her like, hey, I did this. This is me. This is me killing this guy. He can tell that she still doesn't buy it. So the man runs upstairs and then comes back down in nothing but a towel. And as I'm sitting there watching it the first time, I'm sitting there like, what's he about to do? Like, I don't understand. Like, he's down here in a towel and he starts talking about like, hey, you just have to remove that barrier. So you just have to, what do they look like naked? You just have to wonder about that. And so then when he says, are you ready for that? And she says, okay. And then just rips off his towel. And here's what's impressive to me about that, why it's so sort of unnerving, is there's no sort of adornment to it. The camera's just stationary. It's just there, and it just happens. And so then he's just standing there for like a minute, fully exposed, which, fair warning for people who are offended by that sort of thing. That is in this film. But then she subverts him by being like, is it my turn? Like, can it be my turn now? And you can see on his face where he's like, okay. And then like, there's just all of this interesting little back and forth where every time you think the film is going to sort of, again, the phrase I keep coming back to, every time you think the film is going to hide, it just reveals. And I'm saying that, using the metaphor or whatever.
I thought this is where you're about to go. In terms of the nudity in film idea, like I will give credit here. I read this and it just kind of opened my eyes even more to how much I appreciated it in a review. But notice, so the nudity, yes, he exposes himself. He's head to toe naked on screen. Well, then she says, is it my turn? And like the first film, this is a found footage concept,
right.
It's a handheld camera kind of approach because she's a filmmaker. Well, I thought this is where you're going. Did you notice, talking about moving character and plot forward, that when she disrobes, he is discomforted by it and the camera is only on her face.
Yes.
And I was like, that's brilliant. In. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which, it's, I don't know. It's just such a great choice creatively. Because you as a viewer, you're like, as a male viewer, I it's a naked dude. I'm like, yeah, that's a naked dude. But when you subvert that and the sort of at least historically inherent titillation of a nude female, you start to feel uncomfortable watching it. And you're like, oh, well, okay, whatever.
Yeah,
it's
like, don't do this.
And then
Right,
he's
right.
zooming in like, wow, this is really powerful what they're doing, and sort of the revealing idea you're talking about here.
Oh, absolutely.
I skipped over inadvertently, like, to your point about maybe the draggy nature of the kind of 3/4 mark. I was so propelled by the first 30 minutes, starting with the scene with Dave. Right?
Oh,
the friend.
gosh, yes.
That performer is so great.
Oh, he's
he
wonderful.
is so
Yes.
great. I was like, this poor schlub the movie opens with effectively just a 5-minute version of the first film, like just another victim of Duplass's character. He plays all his cards. He kills this poor sap within minutes who just thought he had a friend. I mean, and it's such a great vignette that ends with they're at this, like, just run of the mill dining room table. He has slit the guy's throat. The guy slumps over. There's blood everywhere. And Duplass just puts his hand on his head and is talking about having turned 40. And just stares at the camera. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm turning 40 next year. Who do I need to kill? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. You either have to kill somebody or expose yourself to somebody.
Oh my gosh. Please don't do either of those things.
That's the rules of 40. Anyway, so yeah, I was just really propelled by that opening kind of half hour. And I even loved the opening score. I know that's random, but the title score is just really strong. Yes. You mentioned this already, but I love the brazenness of his monologue to her.
Yeah.
Probably two of my favorite. I'm just kind of plowing through these. I'm sorry.
Sure. No, you're fine. You're fine.
Two of my favorite moments from this movie that just made me just laugh to the room and say, "Did you see that? Isn't that funny?" Just
I'm rubbing off.
You are. You're picking
Yes.
up. I'm picking up your habits. One I love. So in the first film, if you haven't seen it, this recurring convention that happens is the videographer's following him around. The videographer loses him as they're wandering through the woods, and Duplass just leaps into frame and yells and kind of screeches at you. And you as the viewer are genuinely sort of alarmed when it happens. Well, they start having this sort of mutual respect start to develop between them in the second film. The woman filmmaker and him, I'm not even looking at their name. Sarah is her name.
Yeah. Sarah.
And he attempts the scream at her, and she's totally unfazed.
Yeah.
And
it's great.
And in a great bit of acting by Mark Duplass, he just is like, he's incredulous, and he just just totally naturally on camera, he's like, huh. Well, you're a tough nut to crack. I mean, it was just a great, little character moment that just did a whole lot with a very little. So I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
And I don't know which ones these are, but the film just had a rough outline. Like with the first one, they did not have a script.
Right.
So what I read was that because the film was only an outline, a lot of the choices, and I don't know what they are. It is entirely possible that Duplass's choice to just come down and appear naked was completely spontaneous, because it said a lot of their choices were unknown to the other one. So a lot of the reactions are real.
Wow.
A lot of the decisions that they made were not like they didn't know what the other person was always going to do.
Sure.
And then again, I don't know specifically which moments were planned, which moments were part of the outline, which moments were spontaneous. But I just thought that was really fascinating that they crafted this, and because it's a pairing that is intentionally subverting the first pairing, like you said, they're kind of equals. So the choices that they would make would continually like surprise the other one. And I thought that was fascinating. One thing that I really loved, getting back to like his sort of feeling flummoxed that she's not unnerved by it. I love that after the film's been going for a little while and he's coming up and she's taking a shower because they've been doing all these different things. And then he creeps up there, and when he creeps up, it's like you totally think he's going to scare her. I can't remember if he's got the mask on at that point or what, but you totally think he's going to scare her. And when he rips the shower curtain back where she's taking a shower, when he rips the shower curtain back, she has put like scotch tape all over her face in this weird array, and she does the scream to him and genuinely like gets him where he's like where he gets scared. It's fantastic. It's great. Yeah, there's a lot of, and that's what I think is necessary for if you're watching this film. There's tons of intentional subversion of expectation happening. Sometimes just beat for beat. There's like what you expect to happen. Almost the entirely opposite thing is about to take place.
Well, and you talk about subversion. We had a brief mini conversation last week during FVJ Dawn of Viscera about the pivot from fear to camp. And I think what's so interesting in this movie, I would not categorize either of these as campy in intention, but they utterly and completely subvert what is genuinely creepy in the first film, and that is Peach Fuzz.
Oh, yes.
The Peach Fuzz mask and his behavior with it on in the first movie is genuinely scary to me.
Right.
I mean,
right. No, it is.
It's used to great effect, and it is totally defanged. You like that?
Mm-hmm. Nice.
In this second film. But so Peach Fuzz shows up twice in this movie. One, he's just driving and she's got the camera on and he's just talking just from under Peach Fuzz. Whereas in the first one, he's like heavy breathing and all this stuff. And it's really a funny bit. Well, then probably and or possibly my favorite just comedic moment of the movie is he's trying to convince her to cut his head off with an axe. And he puts the Peach Fuzz on and lays on his stomach with his head over over the end of a table so that if she actually does cut his head off, it's going to fall off. And she goes to start swinging. He's got Peach Fuzz on. And he's like, oh, wait, hold on. And she pauses and he just goes, woo! Like at a sporting event. Like in Peach Fuzz character. And he's like, okay, go ahead. Oh my gosh, it was hysterical.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. It was really fantastic. And you're right. It's like, that's what it almost feels like. And I know I felt this way. I can't remember if I told you this in sort of pitching Creep 2 to you, but it feels like all of the obvious places where you would think a sequel goes, they go to, it's almost as if they made out a list, and maybe they did, I don't know. It's almost as if they made out a list. Okay, here's what sequels are expected to do. They're expected to up the ante here, or they're expected to do this, or they're expected to do this. And it's almost as if they were like, all right, all of these bullet points on this list of what sequels are quote unquote supposed to do, let's just do the opposite. Let's just do the exact opposite thing. Instead of making Peach Fuzz creepier, let's just completely inoculate him,
right?
And then
right.
and then instead of hiding the fact that he's a serial killer, let's just go ahead and tell the audience right up top, this is what I am, and tell the characters, this is what I am, this is what you're about to see. And it's just,
well, what's so funny
nuts.
about you saying that is the feeling I had, and I know I keep coming back to that I'm a serial killer monologue, and I'm just now kind of finding the words to articulate this feeling when he says those lines. I remember having this like subconscious, like, wait a minute, you're breaking the rules. Like, this is not
right.
You're limiting your creative potential after this moment. It's like this real feeling of like, are you sure you want to do this?
Oh my gosh, it's great. It's so great. Yeah, it's really, really good. So yeah, there's lots of really, and in the same vein as the first one, there's lots of really unsettling, unnerving moments. Do you have any specific, if you were done with likes, dislikes, do you have any specific sort of scares or moments that creeped you out significantly?
I only wrote down one, but I will add another to it. But I mean, her taped face literally made me jump. I mean,
it's very scary.
I legitimately jumped when that happened. When you talk about subverting things, that definitely did the trick. Although it did also make me think of Pee Wee Herman in Pee Wee's Big Adventure,
as everything does.
And, like,
oh my gosh.
So I do think I don't know what I would have thought was going to happen, but once they're out in the woods and it's revealed that the hole he's dug, that is a little, for a movie that had begun to make me comfortable in the comedy, in the black comedy.
Right.
That moment I was like, oh no.
Well, and that's also where it pivots for her as a character too.
Yeah.
Because that is the moment where suddenly, she spent this entire time basically like, oh man, this guy's jacked up. And we haven't mentioned this right now. The way that she gets roped into this is not merely that she answers a personal ad, the way that Aaron did in the first film. Is she is actually making a web series that she calls Encounters, where she answers personal ads of strangers and tries to do this kind of, she's initially sort of going for a slice of life type of peek behind the suburban life curtain and just like, hey, these are the secret worlds of these strange people. What kind of connections are they trying to draw from? And then as a function of that show, she gets roped into Mark Duplass's character, who in the first film was called, I forget if he was called Josh or something, but in this film he has taken on the name of the last film's victim, which is really unsettling in its own right. But so she just sort of gets caught in his little web, and we don't know exactly what he's got planned for her, but all of that stops. Like you said, all of the fun, all of the, this is weird and quirky and just sort of unsettling and we're not sure where it's going. When you see that he's dug this grave, then immediately it's like, oh crap. And again, that's how it gets for her as well. She takes on this aura of like, okay, now I have made a grave miscalculation and I've gotten myself into potentially a fatal situation here.
Well, and I do think that whole sequence is strong. I mean, I not just the grave reveal itself, but man, when he stabs her multiple times, kind of in the distance, and that's really alarming and jarring. And then when he drags her into the open pit, and then he's talking to the camera, and she kind of claws her way out of it. It's a very effective.
Oh my gosh,
couple of minutes.
Yeah, and you commented, I think we both did, on the first film about how impressive his ultimate kill of Aaron in the first film is.
Yeah,
like how it's I don't know how that, but in the same way, like the way he kills Dave in the very beginning, I'm like, man, that looks eerily real.
Right.
And then when where I'm going with that is that when she crawls out of there and grabs that shovel and clocks him upside the head, I'm like, I don't know how I know it's trickery, but I don't know how they did that. That looked very authentic. I don't know how they did that.
Well, and to that point, and spoiler alert, the movie ends, she does get away. And I mean, it's been highly suggested or is in the works that there's going to be a third film, but she gets away. And the last shot of the film is from a sort of found footage camera vantage point on a train. She gets on the train and sits there. Well, then whoever's holding the camera starts whistling a tune that Duplass's character has already done so in the movie. So you just naturally assume, and they lock eyes. But in that moment, that was one of the few dings I might have against the movie is I think it's a bit of a stretch that she survives. I think it's a real stretch that he survived.
Survived that.
Yeah. I mean, you got clocked from the back of the head by a metal shovel and blood splatters the camera.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's what's really fascinating about the film, and that's we won't know until Creep 3, but that's what's fascinating about the film is the way this franchise with only 2 entries has established itself as a subversion. I don't know if you know this, but on IMDb it says Creep 3 and it says in development, but it doesn't even have a cast list.
Oh, really?
Like we don't know definitively if he did survive because it's just heavily implied. All of it is just heavily implied, but we don't know that it's him holding that camera. We don't know. I mean,
I hear what you're saying. I do think the implication is close enough to.
Oh, the implication
explicit.
The implication is almost definitive. But again, I lean back on this is a film and now a franchise that has sort of made its name on subverting expectations. So I just don't know, you know. So, but yeah, you're not incorrect that.
As long as the third movie has full frontal male nudity, I'm there.
I don't know what to respond to that. I no longer know what to say.
See, I'm subverting the moment. I'm taking the last 100 episodes of Fear of God and just subverting it, you know?
That's terrible.
Making you legitimately uncomfortable. I've got, I mean, this is actually an unexpectedly brisker conversation than I anticipated, but that's okay, you know? I mean,
That's all right. That's all right. We're subverting expectations.
We are.
People are
usually
accustomed to the hour and a half, 2 hours.
We're used to like 2-hour conversations. They're like a 30-minute mark.
It's not over yet. So let's.
It's true. It's true. I really only. Well, I guess why I was saying that is like I really only have one thematic element that's really meant to be just a springboard for conversation. I don't know what you've got.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons I think this movie is strong is even thematically, it does different things. Like what I came away from the first Creep film feeling, I really didn't with this one. And if anything, I think there's a conversation to be had here about that I am a serial killer monologue. And there's this, I suppose, famous quote that's been going on around for a couple of years now on the social medias, and don't ask me to attribute it correctly, but basically it's the notion of when someone tells you who they are, believe them, this idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I just want to camp out there for a few minutes and see if it takes us anywhere. But like, I just wonder, you know, you watch this film, and I think one of the strengths of this film is that though in one more subversive aspect, what is generally perceived as a sort of weaker specimen in terms of physicality and what could she hold her own against a man, a female character, you know, you are naturally concerned for her.
Right. Kind
of from go, in part because of historical gender kind of conventions. But then when he is so forthcoming with his behavior and history, and you're like, no, girl, get out of there.
Right.
And I guess I don't have much more to sort of launch us there other than to just say, like, what do we do with the people who by their words and by their actions just reveal who they are? And in like in this movie's instance, the who they are that is revealed is not just unhealthy, but dangerous.
Right.
And yet we kind of indulge or pacify or accept because it further accept what is given because it furthers our own kind of ambitions. You know what I mean?
Right. Oh yes, absolutely. Let me scratch at this, because you had this idea of when somebody says who they are, believe them. One of the things that I find really interesting about initially what this film is sort of doing, and it's not immediately obvious, but in reflection it's obvious. He is being more authentic to her than she is being to him. He doesn't even give her his real name.
Right.
But he is being more
That is
truthful.
a great moment when he was like, that's your real name, isn't it? Huh.
Oh, yes,
that's great.
yes.
That's great.
Yeah. But she's there under the facade of trying to obtain this, she doesn't even mention encounters. Like, she doesn't even do that. She's just answering this ad. She doesn't mention it. It's a surprise to her when it's revealed later in the film that he already knows about her web series. And so it's just interesting to me that he is being more truthful and authentic with her, even in the midst of all of his chaos, than she is being with him. She's constantly sort of playing a game of like, hey, I have to chase this. I have to get this footage. I have to get this thing. And so it's fascinating to me how, people reveal who they are by their words and by their actions. And meanwhile, we act incredulous. So like, that's not real. That's not, you're not serious. You don't really mean it. And then it's so easy for us in subtle and accidentally manipulative ways to live entire facetious lives, to where we're in all of our encounters, we're I'm thinking of that Chris Rock bit where he said you don't meet somebody,
right, you meet the representative.
You meet their representative. And I think that's really an easy trap to fall into, to where we're basically being the representative to people all around us and kind of presuming the same of them. Whereas in moments like this, we would be inclined to just. It's funny how we talked last week about fear mongering and like promoting fear and all this other sort of stuff, and I wonder if there's this weird juxtaposition where we will, in biblical language, strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Like we will raise up, be afraid of that, be afraid of that, be afraid of this, be afraid of this. Meanwhile, somebody else is like, by the way, I'm a serial killer, and we're like. How funny. What a jokester.
Right.
You know? And to put that in some real world context for some people to be like, what are you saying, Reed? Where it's this notion of be afraid of that people group, be afraid of this trend, slippery slope over here, dangerous trend over here, be afraid of all these sort of political and social ideologies or whatever. Meanwhile, a man stands up and says, yeah, I could shoot someone in the middle of Times Square and not,
right.
I don't remember his exact quote,
lose voters.
And not lose voters. And so it's one of those things where, and I'm not, picking on him in that moment. I'm just saying like, hey, it's easy for us to dismiss certain more subtle and insidious things, which are actually not that subtle.
But do you think? Okay, see this is good. Hey, Reed.
Hi, buddy.
Welcome to number 2. Because I'm trying to mentally, and it's difficult at 11 o'clock Eastern time with a couple of beverages in me and mental acuity slightly diminished. But I'm trying to wrestle down some of what I'm trying to figure out here. Like, on the one hand, I want to be respectful of the complexity of the human animal, right? We are a confluence of competing impulses that one sort of day to the next, 1 hour to the next, 1 minute to the next, sometimes one less healthy might win over what we would want the more healthy to be instead.
Right.
We are not just one thing. And so that's sort of what I think that's the challenge against when someone tells you who they are, believe them. Like the challenge is, well, people are complex. So there's 2 thoughts here. One is you pay attention to trends, right? Like,
right. What
is the history? What is the sum of a life? What is the sum of, and you and I are old in our own heads, but are young in the span of a typical lifespan.
Right.
But what is the general trend of one's life, and how might we make certain assertions based on observing that trend? But something that is coming to me that maybe fits this more kind of faithful conversation mold is, because what it seemed like you were trying to position there a minute ago was it's almost like all we observe in each other is this chaotic complexity, and again, it's an easy example here, but it does fit a lot of these columns here. I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose voters. Like you and I, sub in someone who's not our current president to kind of diminish some of that. But it's like you and I would hear that and think, what? Oh my God, why would anyone still be on this person's sort of side or whatever? Oh, but part of that is just because hyperbole rules our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I'm trying to sort of wrestle down here is the simplicity of the biblical notion of letting your yes be yes and your no be no.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
And how we're so flagrant and careless and thoughtless about our speech.
Right.
And so when someone says something that's indicative of extremely kind of negative behavior or thought patterns, because we occupy and populate an entire culture with hyperbole and cynicism and sarcasm, we're like, oh, locker room talk. Like, what?
Right.
You know, like we because we've so watered down sincerity and earnestness and thoughtfulness and tenderness and direct, heartfelt speech.
Right.
You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here.
Well, here's the other element of it too, because I'm thinking in context, and these are complicated issues that we're butting up against, and you know, this is not necessarily the moment to have this full conversation.
I mean, the towels are off, Reed. The towels are off.
But like, I have thought a lot about the similarities between people. Okay, so let me say this. So I have thought long and hard about the differences we take between those who have said or done inappropriate things and had careers and legacies completely vanished and careers and legacies completely washed away, and how I juxtapose that with our president and what he has said publicly. And this is me exploring, not explaining this thing, and wrestling through this.
Will you clarify a little bit? Like what?
Okay, I'm
maybe
referring. Let me just go ahead and.
You're saying why do certain people lose careers and this person doesn't? Is that
right. How do we reconcile what happens to a Roseanne and what happens to a James Gunn and what happens to a Donald Trump, or doesn't at those moments? How do we justify those things? One person makes and I won't be vague. Roseanne makes a comment that, when read, appears to be blatantly racist and disrespectful. She swears up and down that it was misinterpreted and misunderstood. She has a legacy of conspiracy theorizing and, provocation on the internet and everything. And so she swears up and down that it was not that. A few of those close to her basically are saying like, hey, I know her not to be this person, blah, blah, blah. She loses that show, has to, now we have the Connors and all this other sort of stuff. So that's point one. Then you have James Gunn, who built his career as a provocateur and made all of these jokes about admittedly very crass and very distasteful subjects, to the degree that 6 years ago he apologized and distanced himself from those tweets that he had made, saying that he regretted them then, he regrets them now, all this other sort of stuff. His career with Disney and Marvel is now over and gone and done with, and that's point number two. He's done with. And in his case, Roseanne's a bit more of a divisive case. In James Gunn's case, there were a plethora of people sort of coming to his aid, and I would say much more people sort of coming to his aid and defense than came to Roseanne's, by my sort of estimation of the internet percentages. And so you've got that, but then you have the President of the United States, who, not while campaigning, but was revealed and released while campaigning some despicable and distasteful things that were said off camera, or what they were said on camera, but they weren't,
mic. Right.
They were said on mic. He says these things and he, apologizes for them. I'm not getting into conversations where people may think I'm going. He apologizes for them, calls it locker room talk. And I admit that the circumstances are a bit different. He was elected by the United States of America, not, hired by Disney, but relatively ramification free in terms of those, because by the way, that tape was released prior to his election. And so in my head, where I'm going with all of this, again, I don't have a bumper sticker. I don't have a profound statement that I'm about to make. I'm exploring because this is a complex issue that I'm trying to wrap my head around.
Right.
What happens to a Roseanne? What happens to a James Gunn? What doesn't happen to a Donald Trump? Where do we reconcile right and good and belief and jokes and comedy and not comedy and carelessness with our speech and not carelessness with our speech and intentional provocation and accidental racism and all of these other sorts of things? How do we reconcile all of these sort of cause and consequence with these things?
Is that rhetorical, or you want some feedback?
No, please do. Yeah. None of our conversations are rhetorical.
I know. I just like being asked for my thoughts.
And saying the word rhetorical.
No, there are better words out there, but that is a decent one. Well, one, in the case of Donald Trump, regardless, love him or hate him, the mechanism currently kind of protects him from these sorts of things. You know,
Exactly.
If the mechanism doesn't want to punish, it won't. But it's really funny. Like about 10 minutes ago, I had this thought, and I was like, "Well, that's too lofty for it." It was in the moment. It felt like too lofty a concept to throw in the mix. But your questions are leading me to this to throw it in here. Like, to me, a few steps down the road from yes being yes and no being no is what does repentance look like?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and I know you and I would be sympathetic on this, but like, and even let's in as much as we can, let's take the Roseanne out of it, but it is worthy of conversation and comparison. Let's talk about James Gunn. We haven't done that yet. Like, what a crappy, we're in number 2 series. What a crappy thing that has happened here. Because I think, you know, and I am not importing these things from just anywhere. 15 minutes ago, I said, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. James Gunn's career, creative output, and verbal dialogue in culture has shown us who he is. And that is
That's
a man
true. Yes.
who has repented of these more volatile, intentionally provocational bits of whatever, pseudo comedy he had put out in the world at what he would even have said was a very dark time in his life. Like, that is difficult to ignore. And in fact, I don't think should be ignored. Like, this is, I didn't know you were going down this path and introducing
I didn't either.
these test cases, but you're making my point. Like, what the sum of a life. That doesn't mean people aren't permitted grace, forgiveness, and the opportunity for repentance. That's why I invoke that word here. Right. But it does mean we just the observation of a life. A James Gunn who, my gosh, unrelated to this most recent blow up. I think it was between Guardians 1 and 2. I remember him releasing this kind of statement in light of the success of maybe the first one, I can't remember where it fell chronologically. Releasing this statement of pure, unadulterated gratitude for where he was in light of where he had been in life.
Yeah.
And is that not repentance? Like,
I understand.
This is who I was. It was not a thing or person or behavior that I am proud of. This is now who I am. I am grateful for that transformation. I mean, and you've got, and I don't want to dwell too much on these, but these are good comparison cases. You've got a Roseanne who, again, you and I are not privy to the much less these people's hearts, but definitely their inmost circles. So we are basing this purely on our own kind of casual observations, but having an interest in not just the media landscape, but in sort of the conversation as well. And someone who it feels like, and you make this conversation point a lot, got caught. And hear me, repentance can come crashing hard on you in the midst of having gotten caught. Right. But it looks a lot different to the sum of a life that is defined by intentional, mean-spirited provocation that is deliberately laced with harmful and hateful speech. Speech. Like, these things are all intertwined. Right. And I don't totally know how to pivot all this back to the movie per se, other than to just sort of say, like, there are safe places for the casual speech. You and I are a safe place for each other. Our listeners are a safe place for you and I. Like, there is respect, there is deference, there is appreciation, there is, grace shown. When someone who might be a Trump fan hears Nathan go off, like, I think at this point, you and I have sort of earned some of that, not especially with each other, and that's what really matters here. But, like, there is a place for that. But doggone, man, you've got, and there's this weird thing that's happening in our society right now, where it's like, and gun is a perfect example. Like, well, Bryan Stevenson talks about we are more than the worst thing we've ever done.
Right. Right.
And I just think that is a good touch point definition for grace. Now, yeah, there are going to be natural consequences for our actions sometimes, and we can't ignore those things. But in at least the cases you've thrown out, I think a gun had done plenty of time for personal flagellation for those quote unquote things he had done. Anyway, I don't know. I'm just kind of...
Well, let me try to bring it back to the film.
Yeah.
With this, that one element of the film that almost gets lost. I mean, it's never actively lost in the construction of the film, but it almost gets lost in terms of what you're not mindful of it. But that's part of the problem, is that you're not mindful of it, is the camera. The camera is on you.
Yeah.
And, I mentioned earlier, and I still feel this way, that the quote-unquote Aaron, whatever Mark Duplass's real name is, we don't know. But in this film, he's Aaron. And whatever Aaron is doing feels, at least initially, like he's being more honest than Sarah is being, even though he's not using his real name and she is using hers. But I remember making this observation with like the rise of reality television, where like the real world, when people stop being polite and start getting real, and then you have like Big Brother and all these reality competition shows. And I can remember thinking, and I still feel this way, it's like, it is impossible. I think it is impossible to know a camera is on you and not be like heightened somewhat.
Right.
Maybe if you spend enough hours around it that it gets normalized, then yes, maybe the facade does fall down, and maybe that's exactly how these reality shows sort of developed their more outrageous moments. But it's like, when a camera is on you, you are going to be heightened to a degree. And I feel like what people forget in sort of the social media world is like, I think we've forgotten in our casual speech nature how public everything is. We've forgotten how, like, the camera is on you. We right now are recording this episode. It will broadcast. Like, the camera is on us. And I think you and I are authentic enough. It helps that we have nearly 2 decades of friendship, so there's an authenticity that it just automatically comes with whenever you and I dialogue with one another. But it's one of those things where, when you're examining this, how much can you really, like you said, and when someone says who they are, believe them, but how much can we even really trust the self that we present when we're at least subconsciously aware that the mic is on, or that the camera is on, and how much of that is authentic, how much of it is fabrication and provocation, how much of it is, well, I know that there's a tremendous amount that is carelessness, sort of widespread carelessness with our language, with our persona, with us just not being mindful of what certain things might mean. And it's funny because what makes Creep and Creep 2 especially, what makes them work is you as the audience member have no idea what's going to happen next. And when you think you know what's going to happen next, then it turns that on its head and says, nope, you thought we were going to hide this, we're going to actually reveal this. You thought we were going to save this, we're actually going to bring it out now. Like, it subverts all of those things, and it constantly puts you off your guard. Well, I feel like social media is kind of that, and then sort of the public nature of all of these things is kind of that similar beast. Like, you don't know what I'll say next. You don't know what I'll do next. And suddenly authenticity is not prided as much as provocation, because authenticity is not going to get that many likes. Authenticity is not going to get that many retweets. Provocation will. And
there's a mountain of studies, that are sort of validating what you're saying, that negativity is far more wildfire in a social media setting than positive things.
Absolutely.
But and I apologize if I'm cutting you off here. And
No, you're fine.
Steering us further away from the movie, and we need to start, heading towards home. And hear me, as someone who does not, our listeners, I just said hear me, and I think that was somebody's bingo card slot.
Oh, it definitely was.
Doggone it. See, performance. Like, you guys have made us self-conscious of our very intimate conversations here. But I am not a great practitioner of these things. That said, Jesus seems so clearly definitive about the need to cultivate an interior self.
Mm-hmm.
And I texted you about this a while ago. I was listening to an interview with a couple of and maybe I don't know who they are precisely or their names right now, but the showrunners for Black Mirror, and Be Right Back came up. And one of their rules for Donald Gleason's replicant character was that he was always broadcasting. So he was never input. He was always
output,
broadcast. Mm-hmm. And I think that's such a perilous danger of our current world. And we are doing it to ourselves, but is why the sort of still small voice kind of verbiage is so cutting and so appealing, because there's no other way to know yourself and maybe even to know God other than to stop broadcasting and go into your closet,
Yeah.
And all those, the verbiage and phrasing about what is done in secret and what is done in private, and versus what is done for all to see, and they have earned their reward kind of idea.
Right. Well,
I'm just.
Oh my gosh! No!
Yeah,
don't
please.
lose that, because that is the problem. I say the problem it's part of the artifice of creep. So Sarah doesn't want to have legitimate encounters. She wants to broadcast encounters so that she can, receive likes. She gets, deeply upset, and the reason she steps into a dangerous situation is because she says, maybe this is what the show's been missing. Only 9 people watched the last one. So who cares about authenticity? Maybe provocation is what's actually going to get it in here. And what does Josh in the last film, what does he do? He films all this stuff. It's all through this. It feels to me, based on kind of where we're going in this conversation and understanding the narrative of Creep, it feels like he knows the biggest tool I will be able to use is I will be able to grab somebody who cannot turn the camera off, who wants to have the camera going at all times, wants the footage, wants to see through the lens of this camera, and that's how I'm going to sort of ensnare them, is through this little device that I'm going to invite them to, and I'm not going to pretend it's some secret hidden thing. I'm just going to be basically utilize the sort of broadcast element of it. Like you said, like no input, no authenticity, turn the camera off, let's have a real moment. I'm going to feed that idea that you always have to be broadcasting, that the camera can't turn off. And I'm going to use that to draw them in and trap them to where by the time they want to escape, they're already out in the woods and they're staring at the grave that's already been dug. And now there's nowhere to go.
But even more than that, like there's such a way in which Josh/Aaron's behavior feels so not premeditated, in this conversation of performative lifestyle, like your inability to not broadcast when it's always on. I mean, think about it. Like he's Josh in one film, he's Aaron in the next, he's Peach Fuzz occasionally. Like now a third film may totally divert and subvert this notion, but is there a real him?
Right.
Because all he does is perform.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a pretty staggering question for all of us.
Right.
You have to. I was about to make a strong statement of like, is there a you to save if you don't know who you are?
Well, but I wouldn't dismiss this, because that is who I believe you would side with me on this. In my faith understanding, like your authentic self is the one Christ is after. He could not care less about your artifice. He could not care less about your performance. Could not care less about whatever you broadcast. Your authentic self is who he's after. Who you are when the camera is off, who you are when the mic is off, who you are when we're not broadcasting. That is who Christ wants. That is who he wants to be in communal relationship with. That is what we're ultimately after. But we continue to develop scenarios in which it is nothing but the broadcast. It is nothing but, and I mean, here, like, we could get real meta. We're not pointing fingers at anybody. We're having this conversation over a podcast. We get it.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But I think there's a legitimacy to, you said on the Black Mirror episode from that Sherry Turkle article that it's like you have to practice conversations with authentic human beings. There are moments that will never be broadcast for anybody that are more vital and important to your well-being and your spiritual health, your emotional health, your mental health. There are moments that will never be recorded that are much more significant than anything that will ever be officially documented, than anything that will ever be officially broadcast. And you have to be attentive to those moments, because I will say this, and maybe this statement is really strong, but you can present yourself as somebody who, hey, I just want to document it because I've got cancer and I just want to document for my son and for my family. That's from the first film of Creep. Or you can straight up say, like, hey, I'm a serial killer. I'll lure people to their death. I've killed 39 people. Like, regardless of whatever it is you say to the broadcast, when the cameras are off, you are alone, you are by yourself, you are in that private, secret place. That is the person, that is the being that Christ wants to redeem. That is the person that Christ wants to call forth into wholeness and into faithful living. That's who he's after, not the persona, because ultimately, and maybe this gets back to what we were scratching at with the president we elected, who Donald Trump is as a flesh and blood human being in his private moments with these conversations, that because I definitely believe there's an artifice and there's a real, and then with Roseanne, there's an artifice and there's a real. With James Gunn, there's an artifice and there's a real. And the real is what Christ, I believe, is most attended to and most after. I heard a statement, and maybe this can be our sort of pivot to wind down. I'll go ahead and say that the scripture verse I think that's most appropriate is that what we keep referencing, that Matthew 5:37, that let your yes be yes and your no, no, and anything more than that comes from the evil one. But I heard somebody make a statement. This was a preacher who was sort of scratching at something where he said, it's really easy to lash out against the culture. It's really easy to lash out against someone and say, man, if you're from the more conservative, if you're more from the sort of fundamental ideas, you might look at and say, oh, well, Hollywood is just promoting all this stuff. You would look at somebody from the 80s like a Madonna and say, wow, it's just flagrant sexuality. It's just flagrant provocation. That's all that is. And this preacher was observing. He said, what we don't realize is that the Lord looks at that and desperately wants that person to be redeemed and in relationship with them. Like, desperately wants them to just remove the artifice and cast it down. And it is so easy for us to point fingers at the Roseannes, or if you're in that camp, to the James Gunns, or speaking hopefully with some challenging conviction to you and I, to the Donald Trumps, and say, like, hey, let us not lose sight that there is a real flesh and blood human being there that the Lord wants to be in communal relationship with, and that the artifice ultimately may matter to the direction of society, it may matter to the social trends, it may matter to the hashtags, but it ultimately, all that matters to the Lord is who that person is in that secret private self when the broadcast stops and when the camera is put down, and that's the person that Christ is after. And if we can maybe remember that, maybe there'll be some shifting perspective, and we'll begin to recognize that when a person does stop broadcasting and tells you who they are, believe them. And address that, and not necessarily who they tell you through broadcast, but who they tell you in the real. And I don't know this. Maybe there's more that could be scratched at with this conversation, but I think it really just comes down to who the Lord is really after is who you are when the broadcast stops, who you are when when it's not an episode of Encounters or a ploy to lure some new victim in your serial killer trend. That's who the Lord is after.
All right.
Yeah. Wow. This went to some funky places. but no, I mean, like I think there's some good stuff to scratch out there. Hopefully our listeners agree. Are you ready to sort of rip the towel off and bring in old David S. Pumpkins?
Oh, my towel's been long gone, brother. But yeah, let's do that. So welcome David S. Pumpkins to Creep 2, measured on style, scares, and substance. I will start this second number 2 entry in terms of style. I'm going to give it a 4.
Right.
I think it is strong. I think its strength is in relationship to the first film. So, respecting that, it does what it does very well to me.
Yeah, I will sit right there with you with the 4. Debated about giving it a 4.5, but that good subset of about 15 minutes towards the end where it lags for me kind of dings down that half a point. But yeah, I think it's an easily earned 4 for style. It is very clever. It is very smart and sharp, which is all the more impressive when you remember that it was created through improvisation. So yes, it's very, very good.
What about you for scares?
For scares, like we've already mentioned, I think the first film is kind of creepier, scarier, as it were. This one is more sort of spends time with dark comedy and then pivots towards a little bit more unsettling things towards the end. So for scares, I feel 3.5 feels right for this film.
All
yeah,
right.
so
that's actually a little higher than I was expecting.
So,
I think for me, you are pulling me up a little bit here. I'm going to go for a 3. Like right. I my impulse was 2.5, but I like you, and I don't want to be alone in my thoughts. So I'm going to go with a 3. I do think it's got, you know what? No, I'm going to change it. I'm going to be me. I'm going to go 2.5 because
all right.
I don't think it is a scary movie. I think it's got some really great black comedy to it. I think those 2.5 points are representative of holdover from the first film and what I took in with it, as well as that last kind of 15 minutes. But I don't think it's very scary. As far as substance goes, I'm going to give it, I mean, clearly we drew a lot out of it. And I think this is a thoughtful film. Improvisation improvisation does not suggest whatsoever carelessness. And I think they were very intentional and very thoughtful about what they were putting in here and worked very hard to make it say something distinct and be something different than its first entry. So I'm going to go for a 4.
All right. This one's tough for me. Because I feel like a lot of what I love about the film is actually in its stylistic choices rather than its thematic choices. I'm actually in a rare pivot. I'm going to go a little down. I'm going to go 3.5 for substance. I think there are some interesting things there, but it's
this is why you're a great human being. The way you qualified that, I was expecting like a 2, and you're like, I'm going to go a half point less.
I'm going to go just slightly below that. But yeah, because I mean, I do think there's some substance there. I think there's probably quite a bit. But most of what I responded to were sort of more the stylistic choices than anything else.
So that brings number 2, part 2, which is Creep 2, to a whopping 7 David S. Pumpkins. That feels
yes,
that feels appropriate.
I like that.
So yeah, Reed, this is fun.
I'm loving it.
We're in the middle of a 3-episode number 2. I mean, I don't know what you ate, but it was not good.
Feels like we're right back there in Grandma's bathroom.
Past the guidepost. Next week, we will be discussing the second entry in the Purge series, that of Purge Anarchy. Reed, thank you so much for this rather robust conversation. I will see you next week. And folks, we'll see. We like that phrasing. We'll see y'all next week as well.
Bye, everybody. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end of the conversation. And you can continue the conversation in a variety of ways. You can follow us on Twitter @TheFearOfGod. You can like and follow us on Facebook or join the Facebook Fear of God discussion group. You can follow us on Instagram @FearOfGodPodcast. Go to morethanonelesson.com for show notes or to leave a comment on this post or any of the other official episode posts. Email us at fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. And last but not least, if you listen to us through iTunes, we would greatly appreciate a rating or review. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.